So, I did a recent discussion. I'm being triggered reading my way through the rules of Tanto Monta here. And yes, I will get to it, but I'm about 2/3 of the way through them. Now, I'm reading a lot slower than I usually do, largely because not only do I have my raid addiction, but now I have another stupid gacha game that I'm playing at the same time. Some of it being that I just am not enjoying reading these rules particularly, but that's not really the subject here. But this is the second time I've made a video while I'm reading these rules, somewhat triggered by them. And this one is about something I brought up in the other video, but I don't think I went into enough detail about, which is the differential between, I know I've hit on this in other videos as well, the differential between different kinds of event-driven games, right? So, the CDGs, and using the term rather broadly, games which have their events on cards. That's a remarkably effective mechanism for giving small, short events, okay? Going back to the old days when you had things like War of the Ring, where you drew cards and you had capabilities that you could play through the cards. I'm not thinking here about things like Risk, where it's, sort of like a core mechanism that doesn't really get changed by text on the cards or whatever. But games where you have a card that maybe gives you special capabilities that you can play from your hand or whatever. I'd also walk into, as I often do, always picking on the games that really settled in my mind, many of which are much older because I got more chances to play them. Empires of the Middle Ages, which had an event deck. And, some of these were pre-programmed type of things. You go on to your CDGs as, sort of trailblazed, I guess. Invented, although the invention feels like, a step only a small step further from what many other cards are in games. But you take a look at some of the Mark Herman stuff, and look, We the People kept things very, very simple. Later ones have started flowing into a more complex sort of event card. So, for example, recently I played Clash of Sovereigns, which may have been among the heaviest and most annoying of its type. I've been running into quite a few that are like this, though, that just have too much going on in a given card to fit on the card. Now, with most of the games that do this, that too much is something, along the lines of, maybe there's 2 or 3 cards that need a special rule and a fair amount of detail in it. Now, when we look at Tanto Monta here, it is about 1/3 of a 60-page rule book. 160, 64, but some of it's, charts and stuff like that. And there's a lot of pictures and everything in it. But still, it's a relatively meaty rule book. Now, if you took that 1/3 of it away, right, you'd get down to like a 40-page rule book, which is about normal for a system-type game. CDGs, the coin system, levy and campaign in the modern era, right? That's about the same size as GMT bloat, etc. And, there's good and bad points to that bloat, but imposes on these systems. Where the majority of the rule book by far is just telling you about the core game, right? And then there may be, and that core game may be a little different from other games in the series or type. Certainly with CDGs, it often is wildly different in terms of how interceptions are handled and whatnot. This game, coming off of the Here I Stand family, basically, uses, which seems to have been particularly egregious in generating games where people are trying to reach for something more than CDGs, I think, or cards in general can provide. It tends that family tends to go overboard. Where Here I Stand was a beautiful, fairly simple game, even though it had some specific mechanisms that only a couple of players might use, and nobody used all the rules basically. CDGs that have come off of it have been trying to reach for more and more detail and expressing of historical events and whatnot. And so there's a tendency for its children to be overburdened, in my opinion, starting from Virgin Queen. And, some of them have problems in terms of failure to, properly vet and play test and do a copy editing even. GMT tends to have a certain standard there, which more and more is getting thrown by the wayside, but this is not the video for that. But it is rather ridiculous to say, look, there's only X amount of room on the cards, and we need events that, take up significantly more space, and we need about 20 pages of information on how to handle these events and how to handle these special cases in Chrome type situations. And I would say some of this 20 pages is not events, but rather other kinds of Chrome that, isn't necessarily directly related to the cards. But I ran into one that's clearly got to do with a particular card, and it's, about a page of rules on it. Now, this drives you into a couple of problematic areas, and I'd like to compare it to an event-driven game with rich and powerful events that I love, which pretty much avoids this issue by creating an event booklet. And that's Europa Universalis, the original. For what it's worth, many of the problems that this faces are also faced by the game that was derived from the computer game, Europa Universalis, Price of Power, or whatever it was called, that I played recently. That has other problems, which this may also have, this being Tantamonta. But, and those other problems are the amount of game state that's being expressed through cards on the table and all kind of things that are out there is just more than I feel is reasonable. It's certainly more than I could handle. It's not really a matter of playing solo, because all that game state, in order to make good decisions, you have to have it all in your head. But, anyway, Europa Universalis has a 40 or 60 page, I don't know how big it is, I could look at it, but it covers a huge amount of period, right, of time. It has a huge set of different eras worth of events that happen. And they're just rolled, and then you go seek them out in the book, and it's kind of like using a paragraph system in terms of, if you think about things like Voyage of the Pandora, if you're more familiar with games like that, or Tales of the Arabian Nights, where there's all this information, but it's kept separately. And in one sense, keeping it all separately provides a couple of things. First of all, You don't have to try to fit too much text on the cards. And obviously, here in this game, it would be impossible. In most CDGs, there are at least a couple of cards that it's impossible for. In EU Pop, it would have been impossible for a significant amount of the events that are in the game that are represented by a card or whatever. In the original EU, it would be absolutely ridiculous because, well, I mean, for some of them, they changed the whole game for, a few turns or something like that. Like, they significantly changed the way things work in the game. And it's all, there are scenarios where you're playing that event in that game. Something that, you don't have in most of these other games. If you look at the earliest CDG, if you look at like We the People or what, well, I don't remember if We the People had it. If you look at Washington's War, but I think it comes from We the People. You had the Lord North card, which has a significant amount of rules to it, but it really is kind of the one card in that game that like changes the game. If you look at Twilight Struggle, you have the scoring cards. They're a type of card. There's a handful of them. They need their own rule. If you look back at Empires of the Middle Ages, you have, I'm trying to think what, Heresy card. There was too much information to fit on that card. So you have a couple of little cards that need to be called out and need to have their own special rules. Usually not as extensive as what I'm finding here. What I'm finding here, while not as extensive as the biggest things in EU, and the smallest ones are tiny, they're like, make a roll to see if your leader dies, stuff like that, take up no space at all and could have easily been fit on a card. But one of the things that's really horrible is what it means is you're going to constantly, you're going to lose that advantage of cards that express everything, right? And have to do a lot of rules lookups to look up the things. Now, how much worse is that than doing a rules lookup on an event when it comes up? Yeah, I don't think terribly. But the play style of CDGs in particular is such that you're handed a handful of cards, you're looking through them, you're already doing a lot of processing, trying to figure out and optimize what your best moves are for your strategy or whatever, in order, based on the cards you hold in your hand. So those cards kind of need to give you a lot of the information, if not most of it, that you actually want for what's going on. And you have choice in the matter as well. You're sitting there with these cards and you have an opportunity, and this is true in EPOP as well, or EU Pop as well, you have an opportunity to make decisions based on when you want these events to trigger, which ones you want to, activate. Some of them are not mandatory, whatever. All that kind of stuff is kind of baked into the decision-making process. Whereas if you look at the pure event-driven style of the original Europa Universalis, it's really a matter of I roll a couple of dice, well, 4 to be precise, I think, and they're at 11 to 66 each, I think. Not positive about that. But, no, I don't know, there's weird things with it. Anyway, you roll dice, get an event, and it happens. And now you're faced with this event as if it's just hey, these are things that are going on this turn, and you use the normal mechanisms of the game in general to deal with them, although there might be specific rules for them. In this one, though, in CDGs in general, in EU Pop, you're forced to, by the style of play, the decision by the designer, to make a great deal of... all right, we got a brain fart here coming out because we lost our word. You have a great, it's not what I want to say, but you have a great deal of control over, I'm definitely getting stupider, over the players in general have a fair amount of control over how the events are going, when they're going to come out, when they're going to take and have an impact. Agency is the word I was going to use. And in some cases, that feels absolutely wrong, right? Like, it's much, much more intuitive to look at, say, let's take an example in the modern world, the events that came in Syria. Well, that's not something that anyone played, right? The US did things that may influence that. Russia did things that may influence that. But it's not like everyone, someone was holding the card and making a choice of when to trigger that event. That's a sign of agency that often in CDGs and these other newer designs that try to give you that, to try to give you more control over things that no one in your country, that your country as a whole. I'm not looking at this as a role-playing experience. I'm looking at it as do you, as that country, as the conglomerate of that country's actions, foreign policy, diplomacy, whatever you want to, do you actually have the level of agency that's there? It's also kind of weird because you're like given cards that like you would think you would have been able to kind of cause, like you could have made decisions earlier that would trigger that and or give you that capability available, but instead they're just kind of flying at you and you don't have any control over them. And coin is great for this, right? Like it almost feels like a deck building design makes more sense. That you make decisions as to where you want to spend your resource and research points and whatever to add cards to the deck. And then you don't know when that capability is going to actually become available. But once it does, it probably isn't a matter of use it or lose it, which a lot of card-based games have and whatnot. But in the coin-type games, it's like flip something over and you're like, oh, you get to like bomb this if you want. You can take that event and do it. And I'm not sure what position you're in. You're certainly not in that overarching position where you make all the decisions for your nation. But, many of those decisions are outside the theater commander's choice. So what planes may be available and whatnot may not be your option. And, so I'm kind of okay with some of those being driven away, but it's just kind of funny that these card-driven, that a lot of the card-driven designs, and I'm not harshing on the coin series here in particular, because I actually do feel like, at least in the modern era cards, a lot of that stuff kind of makes sense. You're being offered some resource by your government, and if you choose not to do it, you can do other things instead, and that feels very much in the sort of flavor of both CDGs and the coin system. And now the irregular conflict series or whatever it is. That feels wrong. Like, that sounds like an MMP thing. Anyway, it just feels kind of funny because you're given, I'm going to have to swap very shortly, you're given a great deal of agency in terms of what kind of, when you want to use these things, calling on control over stuff, decisions on whether major events may even happen. Sometimes control of the weather that, nobody in that country has, that the country as a whole doesn't have as a capability. Nothing they could do could possibly give them that capability. Therefore, they have wizards, as far as I'm concerned. But they give you, all this agency over stuff that you shouldn't have, yet are further constraining you, and you only have the cards you have. So it's like, it's kind of like it's if you get a weather card, you don't just have a wizard. What happens is a friendly wizard shows up and says, hey, you know how you were going to build tanks? If you give me that money instead, it usually doesn't work that way, but sometimes it does. Those points can be used for reinforcements. Or, instead of moving your army, I can invoke the weather gods. And, you don't have to decide right away. I'll sit by the sideline. But, if I could eat, like, the oil that the troops would use up for that, I would need that to burn, to be able to do the weather control that I want to do. Because I have to make a sacrifice to the great god automobile or whatever. I don't know. I really don't know. Anyway, like I said, I need to swap my batteries, and this is going to confuse me because I finished that thought and I don't know where I'm going to go right away, whereas I probably, if I wasn't worrying about the camera, I probably would manage to. I guess what I'm trying to express, for those of you who aren't actually inside my mind, which I don't know what that quantity is. I see numbers on UTurd, but to tell you the truth, I'm not sure that UTurd isn't just a figment of my imagination. Anyway, I guess what I was trying to express is that there's capabilities that some capabilities feel outside anything you could reasonably say that the player represents, and some capabilities are more restricted than you feel like they necessarily should be by the design itself. I think the more restricted is easier to come up with hand-wavy arguments for why you don't have control over that. That, Hitler tells you to stay in Stalingrad. What are you going to do? That kind of thing is that there may be external pressures on you to do things that realistically you don't have a choice. Anyway. That's kind of a tangent that I didn't particularly expect to go into, because what I was really looking at was so what I was looking at was going over what the different effects between the two different types of things. Now, clearly, you could write the events in the same way in something like an EU type game, where, opportunities that you feel like maybe you should have always had don't become available. But because there's something kind of intuitive about the way the game is designed, it's very easy to put into the event tables the things that you should only be able to do because a special opportunity that you don't have control over arises. A ruler dies, or an heir dies or whatever, and that puts you in a special circumstance that the game wants to drive you down that channel of events, and so they make specific events for them, which may or may not actually happen. It's quite possible that the Habsburgs don't inherit Hungary, shit like that. It's hard for that to happen, but it's possible. Now, if you look at so on the CDG side, you have it's easier for the designer to make what I think is something that makes it more difficult to believe in your role in the game, because you're being given capabilities that not just there's no one person, but that your country as a whole just doesn't have a choice in the matter, that you have choices in, and then there are things that oddly seem like you're extremely constrained, given that you have control over things that you shouldn't have any control over in most of these. Some of them try not to do that. I always pick Clash of Monarchs as the example because they split out their events into two tables, or he, the designer, I can't remember his name now. That's okay. I'm not good with names anyway. Um, Oddly, he kind of seems to have backed away from that, at least as far as my memory is of Clash of Monarchs, with Clash of Sovereigns, putting not all the events into the cards, but ones that players should have less control over into the cards. That's my impression. But again, it's been a long time since I played Clash of Monarchs. Uh, but I thought that was a great sort of compromise situation. Put some of the events on a table, put some of the events in the cards. And the ones on the cards are ones that should be expressed as things the players have more control over, decisions that that country could make as a whole. So that's one side of it. Another side of it is how much information the players have about the game. So, it is quite possible to play either type of game, CDGs or the non-card based events, without knowing a damn thing about those cards, unless there are special rules about them in the rule book. And even EU has some special rules that apply to some events collected together in the rule book rather than that aren't standard mechanisms that are available to you at all times. Collected in the rule book. For example, the unrest rules. Well, unrest is something that happens from the events. That's a very light example, but yeah. Anyway, I mean, you can kind of see the same with a lot of different things, so I don't know. Because that's kind of a generic thing that you expect would be able to happen. So it makes sense to be pulled out that way. I'm not sure that, I can't think of anything in EU that really tells you what the events are going to be, except for the victory point choices. And this is a very interesting thing in that particular game. At the beginning of each era, you choose to prioritize among different goals that your country has. But if you don't know what the events are that are coming, you can either look at a situation and say, geez, I don't know if I can do that. Or you can look at the victory point thing and say, I guess there's an event that gives me an advantage in doing that or whatever. And in both cases, you may be wrong. That game is definitely very. Sometimes there are things that you have no events that will help you or convince you to do that. Which I feel, therefore, probably the better move in that game is to have you choose victory points as events come up. If there's an event that's a surprise that's out of your control, you should be able to shift your victory points based on it, your victory point choices. For example, if the Habsburgs are going to inherit Hungary, if they know they're going to inherit it, and I think there's an event that links the two countries, the Habsburg family to the Hungarian throne, it really should be the Battle of Mohawks, but if I recall correctly. At that point, you're in a situation where you can say, well now I can reassess my victory points and put this, I can up the value of this particular victory condition. And I can shift other things however I like to lower their value to make room for the one that I make. That's just an example of something that I think probably I should add that to the game when I play it, if I play it ever again, if I get to. because we're all hoping that I do not make it through this winter. Of course, we've had those hopes many times before. But you have the same situation with the CDGs. You can play them in the same sort of way where you're like, well, I'm not going to read the event cards. That can leave you in a really horrible situation. There are games where you absolutely need to know the event deck to play it well. I'd say Twilight Struggle is among them, even though it's a fairly simple game. To a large extent, you kind of want to know things like NATO and the Warsaw Pact forming and stuff like that, and what the implications are going to be on gameplay. You may not get to do it when you think you want to, or when you think you should, but it's definitely something that affects your placements and play choices if you have those in your mind. The worst case scenario is Paths of Glory, where you cannot possibly play historically without knowing what some of the cards are. You will fail to recreate World War I, which I find is the opposite of what it should be. The cards should sort of deliver you with the historical experience being more likely, unless you're intentionally trying to deviate from it. Not necessarily same results or whatever, but you should be faced with some of the same challenges, etc. And that trying to avoid those challenges, and this works perfectly fine in some other games. But in Paths of Glory, it's just particularly problematic. But in terms of, you could play that way. You can also play where you know everything and are trying very, very hard to play the most competitive shark-style game that you can. And, I lean towards one, but they're both reasonable and valid ways to play it. I feel like not knowing the events, because of how I see what events should be, is more appealing. I feel like your decisions are rooted, or should be rooted, on what the people in the situation knew, what the nation, what the collective people, right? Again, I don't want to get this into a role-playing type thing. I'm not there like, anyway. But and that's where Paths of Glory goes wrong, because what the people involved in making the decisions knew requires that you know at least some of the cards. But of course, they didn't know most of the cards, like Sinking of the Lusitania. You could say, well, you're taking a risk. Yeah. But there's games that handle that better, in my opinion, by just saying, look, if you're doing unrestricted submarine warfare, it can just happen as an event. It's not something that somebody else chooses whether or not to play. You can make the argument, though, that the choice of playing it represents the British intelligence pushing American ire about it and trying to elevate a situation and bring the U.S. closer to war because of that. Anyway. So, either style of play is possible. I don't know which one is easier. Obviously, the smaller the events are, the easier to read and assimilate and store in your mind, the easier it's going to be to play a very competitive type game. And most CDGs fit into that. EU does not. This doesn't appear to. But it doesn't preclude you from playing it in that kind of competitive sort of style. where you just take all this information and calculate out, what you think the best strategy is based on all of that. And yeah, that's fine. So I don't see an impact of the cards on that kind of situation, except for the fact that most CDGs have simpler events in them than games which are forced to have very large events. There's also the case, let's go really out on a limb here, outside of war games and into an economic game that uses events, which is Star Trader. There's also the case of, there's a bunch of events, and then there's like a a world-shaking event that changes the entire game, that you can win the game off that event if you understand it completely. And clearly, if you pick up the event and think about it, you understand it completely. In this case, it's the inflation shit in that game. You basically take completely different actions. If no one at the table is aware of the event except for the people who have sort of looked at it and have a right to know it, then everybody's just looking around like, wow, what do these people know? Why is everybody gathering so much, why is everybody buying so much stuff? And is the stuff they're buying of importance? Now, when you don't know events in that game and other people do stuff, you kind of have a clue that you had better do something like they're doing. But in the inflation case in particular, it's just such an extreme thing, and it's such a crazy thing that unless you know that the inflation shit exists, you probably won't go all in the way that people who really know it, who have seen it are able to. But if everybody at the table knows that event, and one person does something that aligns them with that event, everyone else is going to say, the only safe thing to do is to treat as if he discovered that event. And that can be used for sandbagging or whatever. But that's okay. That's fine. It's just that one particular event is just so changes how you're going to make a lot of money in the game for a brief period of time that not knowing it puts you at an extreme disadvantage. And there are probably cards like that in some, not to the same extent, but there are cards which if you don't know, let me give you one. In Twilight Struggle, which victory cards are in the deck? Strangely enough, Twilight Struggle is an extension or a modification in a lot of ways of a game that I have, but don't think I have up here, which is called Summit. It was made in the 1960s. Very much, same Cold War type thing, except that it's like 6 players instead of 2. But it has the same kind of scoring cards built into the deck. And if you didn't know when they were coming up, you were screwed. You don't know exactly when they're coming up, right? But that game was so simple comparatively. We're talking like, maybe 8 pages of rolls instead of, 24, I think, for Twilight Struggle or whatever. That it didn't just sort of gloss over. Yeah, you don't read through. You read through it and you realize this is how you win the game. You don't realize that with Twilight Struggle, and it's not the only thing that generates points in Twilight Struggle. So it feels a lot more. It feels a lot easier to not be aware of the rules about the victory point cards when you read the rules. And they're in there, but maybe not a lot of, hey, you should really pay attention to this if you want to try to do well in this game. This is going to be important to your points. And if you want to play historically, you kind of those cards drive historical play, right? The early period of the Cold War puts you in Europe. Later on, you're looking at other areas like Asia and whatnot, and things like Africa and South America don't become that important until very late. So knowledge of the cards in Twilight Struggle is necessary to play historically as well as to play well. Same thing in Paths of Glory. That's okay in a way. Like, if you're reading the rules and that's all you do and you miss that point, well, that sucks. But if you're being taught the game, one would hope that your instructor tells you, hey, you really want to pay attention to this part. This is important. Here's what they are, and here's the order they come out, and you have to know this. It's one of the few things in the deck of cards you just have to know. Otherwise, your play is going to go off the rails, and, you know. Of course, you could also just use your knowledge of history, and when things become important. But the style of, you know, the sort of the game state doesn't give you that, right? And it should in some way or another. There should be some sort of warning what's happening. The way there is in History of the World, where it tells you which regions are worth what, you know, in each period of the game, and that directs your play in a similar way to how Twilight Struggle works. So fundamentally, I think the big issue of difference between the two types of games, first of all, yeah, there's the simple question of how much shit can you fit on a card? If you can't fit if you can't fit the vast majority of the events on the card, if you have to go into the rules and create special rules for those cards, I don't think cards are the right mechanism for you to use in your design. And that feels like a problem in Tantomonto. Another is, if you got a lot of game state being applied with special markers and all that shit, which this seems to do, where it's like, oh, I did one of these this turn and I can only do one. Well, how do you handle that outside of special markers? Yeah, see, the problem is the pulsing and the card play and all that. Everything built together forces you into this. If you want to only be able to do something once a turn, well, you need some kind of special marker for it. If there aren't a lot of such things, that's great. But in Tantomonta, there's a fucking pile of these little chits. Now, some of them are more generic, but there's just a fucking pile of these things that are one-use chits to mark, you know, shit that's happened and whatnot. Just like there are little markers to persist cards in some CDGs and whatnot. And it just looks like a horrible, horrible decision where too much game state is being relayed in a really weird sort of way and not consolidated. It's sort of consolidated on your player card, but yeah. How does something like EU handle that? Well, it's handled because all those decisions are made at once instead of, you know, you have an economic phase, essentially, where you pre-plan your turn and you're put under certain constraints and you just do them, right? And then what comes out of those is through a fairly simple number of mechanisms. It's still a complex game, you know. You have to kind of realize that the battle scenarios, you know, not battle. There's like 3 levels of scenarios. There's ones that are just a battle, I think, but there's ones that are, they all have maneuver and whatnot. The small scenarios will handle like a single war or part of a war or something like that. And you're really just maneuvering your troops and fighting, and you get reinforcements kind of, it's just a pure little war game. It's the war game part of the game. It's not trivial and small. It's got its own complexities to it and whatnot. and then you have a bunch of stuff to support the colonization and the diplomacy and all these other essentially modules of the game that handle it, which give you a complexity that's way beyond what Tanto Monta seems to provide. But they do it with a rule book that, I don't know, it's about the same size for the rule book. Okay, what about the events? Well, the event book is rather large, as I've said, but you know, if you take all the cards and spread them out and look at all the text on all of them, that's kind of large too, okay? That makes up a different means of providing all the stuff that's in the event the event book. And yeah, it's anyway, my general feeling is if you're getting too complex on the events that they don't fit on the cards, don't go with cards. If your system is so complex because of the interleaving, the pulsing, whatever you're doing with the play style, that it creates a bag of game state like this that you have to track for all kinds of individual aspects and whatnot, you're probably using the wrong kind of mechanism to run the game, right? So, I mean, I'm seeing two big strikes against this one. And in particular, that's what is going, that's what sparked my whole, these later games in these series are getting more and more complex, and they're just, you know, they lose the joy that I had in the originals. And I think some of that so there's an initial joy of, it's so cool, there's something new and innovative as the core system of the game. And I would say I felt that with EU, I feel that with a lot of these designs. But then after a few come out, they start feeling kind of the same-ish. And aren't as appealing. And so the idea is, okay, let's build on that. Let's make it deeper. And that makes some sense, but one of the problems is that innovation is a divergence from sort of the main line of gaming, and it is in EU too, where you don't want, like, unless all games that a group is playing take this turn, or a large portion of the games they're playing, take this left-hand turn that you're making, then you're presenting a huge burden and barrier towards a public that's used to a certain kind of game, is willing to accept little extensions and differences to the system, but really probably isn't going to be too happy when you start getting further and further out on a limb. That's more a discussion. That more belongs in the previous discussion, but just something that I kind of didn't say there, even though I kind of whirled around that thought. But in particular with events, I feel like there's only so much that you can do with cards. And that when it goes with gameplay and game state and the complexity that you need to maintain about the game state, that the card-based games, with their particular way of playing, where you're making a decision to do a thing or a couple of things, and this goes for EU Pop as well, and then the next player does his thing, and you're just constantly interspersing your actions with one another, having impacts on each other. I feel like if that starts getting too heavy weighted, if too much state is there, if the decisions are being massively influenced by the incremental actions, that there's a problem there. You want the game to be simple if it's got that kind of interactivity, I think. And you want a much more stately design, I would call it. A slower one that kind of and this is my taste, of course, that rolls out much more in a much more stately fashion. If you have a lot going on, you want to be able to think about that a lot, plot it out, figure out what you're doing. You want the game design to encourage you to do that in the same way that, say, the orders-driven games do in tactical battles. Where you think about, well, where do I want things to be in 10 turns, and you write your orders to deal with that. You want to be encouraging that kind of planning and, in fact, kind of requiring it to be able to play the game at all. Like, you just have to do the work. And in the CWB games, you have to write the orders or your troops aren't doing anything. In something like EU or After the Holocaust, which is a much simpler game, but it has the same kind of, you have a spreadsheet, you figure out what you're doing for that turn, and you plot it all out, and you figure out the costs and everything, and you just have it all in front of you at once to make that decision. And then you get to enact those decisions. And at that point, you can make incremental changes. You can change the way you deploy your troops based on your orders. You can change the way your military moves in EU based on other players' actions, but within the constraints of what you've already done, what you've set up for the turn. CDJs do it very differently. They give you this, I got the whole fucking world in this hand, whatever. I can do whatever the fuck I want. And if somebody does something, I can, veer completely from what I'm trying to do. And that makes sense in a very simple game, or a moderately simple game. The more complex it gets, I think the more problematic it gets, because that kind of opportunistic choice becomes harder. You're dealing with a much larger and more complex manifold of decisions, and it's not something you want to be able to make on a quick calculation. Card games are sort of the optimal, like, I'm talking real card games, things like bridge, are sort of the optimal where you're making these quick choices based on the information you have. And, in bridge you might figure out, what's the odds that he has the queen? or in poker, you're assessing their intention, their I don't know, their psychology, essentially, as to whether or not you think they have a good hand. Obviously, it might be just showing there, and you're like, well, I can't beat that. And then you have to assess the psychology of whether or not you could scare them away somehow. Probably a bad idea. But, yeah, unless you have something that looks scary. But that kind of decision-making, I feel, works really, really well when it's a fairly simple choice, a fairly simple number of factors feeding into it. But this, I fear, and I've certainly seen it in some CDGs, and I've certainly seen it in the modern heavy Euros, the decisions are being made in an interleaved and interactive fashion that hurts, at least my enjoyment. Obviously, there are people who like these. The heavy Euro wouldn't have come about if people didn't like them. But I kind of feel like with Euros, I like my CDGs to be a little on the simpler side. Despite the fact that, like, when I first got into them, and I still love these, I'm being told, oh, well, the ones you're playing are the heaviest of the Euros, and you like, of the CDGs, and you like those. And you could kind of argue the same with early Euros. I actually found myself liking the whole spectrum up to the heaviest that there were, but the flavor of the heavy ones has gone beyond what I see as a reasonable to have that kind of interactive gameplay that a lot of them, well, that almost all Euros have, that CDGs inherently have, and whatnot. And I want that kind of, I want those pulse decisions to be limited. Now, you could take a look at something like Vietnam, which I did not have a fun time with, and never have. But that has an interleaved pulsed actions. But although you have a huge choice, as the U.S. usually, you have a huge choice of operations you might want to take at the beginning of any given turn. Once you choose one, what's going on becomes simpler interleaved decisions. And whatever you choose on the map, then the Viet Cong can make a decision, okay, I'm jumping in here and moving some of my forces because you're putting a threat on me now, right? You're setting things up so that I have to get away. So the focus of that game, even though the whole thing is rather large, the focus at any particular time is on a relatively small number of choices that you could make. Except for the grand choice early in each turn of the U.S. Which of these pieces do I want to try moving first? Where do I have a chance of doing anything? All that. Where you just have a lot of information spread out in front of you. And that's part of what I don't like about it, is it became very hard. I'd have to paw through everything and figure out, okay, this is the one that I want to do. Even though it probably wouldn't matter too much, But in some cases, there were clearly, this has to go before this has to go before that, this has to go before that. And it takes a considerable amount of thought and figuring out the same kind of thinking that I don't like in the Euros and whatnot. I wouldn't mind playing the VC in Vietnam, to tell you the truth. I feel like you're playing entirely reactive. Your focus, you're not the one making the big focus there. You have strategic plans and everything, and they're being expressed perfectly fine. And boy, are we getting off topic. This whole thing has kind of gone off topic because I wanted to talk about the differences between the event, the two mechanisms that I've seen for delivering events, and the split. And the greatest split here is really between the CDG and the EU type game. But then I ran into, but the rest of the game is also causing issues, right? It's causing issues because and in part because of the complexity of the events. The complexity of the events is too much, along with the complexity of other decisions that you're making, of choices that you have, of this big manifold. You shouldn't be looking at your hand of cards and have to really agonize over which one you want to play, and whether they need to be done in orders and whatnot. That hurts me when I have to do too much of that. But anyway, again, just my feeling. And so CDGs have something similar to what Vietnam has, to be honest, which is at the beginning of each turn, you have a handful of cards. And if you're playing something like, can't remember it, Time of Wars, you have a big hand, like 10 or 11 cards in your hand, right? And then as the turn goes down, you end up with a reasonably small hand. Clash of Sovereigns had the same thing at the beginning of each year. You have a huge hand of cards. and you have to figure it all out on that one turn, and then you've got this really nice interactive type of play style, but you got to keep remembering what your orders are and whatnot, and you could write it down, I guess. Probably less hard when not playing solo, but yeah, it's I find it difficult no matter what, you know, to face that first big hand of cards each turn in the same way that I find it hard. And it's a matter of, I've got a bunch of cards, some of which I want to use, some of which I might want to use. Clash of Sovereigns was horrible for this. Some of which I need to hold in my hand so I don't lose them because I want them for next turn, and I have to make sure that they don't end up in the discard pile. Just shit like that where you're like, you know, sorting your hand into like 4 different stacks of, well, these can't be played, these must be played, and then a couple of stacks in the in-between as to how valuable they are and how quick in the turn, how early in the turn you want to get them off, and all kind of shit like that. And it just becomes really, really painful to deal with that kind of manifold of decision making. All right. That's enough. We've gone off of just the event-driven stuff, but I feel like it's all kind of relates to what is worrying me so much about this Tanto Manta, that, you know, incredibly complex rules that are all kind of Chrome, much of that Chrome stuff that belongs in the events themselves. And when it's not in the event, it's telling you what's going to happen. So you can't play, no matter what you want to do, you cannot play as if a rule doesn't exist, right? Like, if you have to read it in the normal rule book, you can't just say, okay, I want to be surprised by the events as they come in, which is, again, that's my favorite style of play when it's plausible. And I know that the Moriscos are going to revolt. It's got to happen. And I know that because there's a rule for it. There's a card in there that does it. There may be another rule that causes it as well. But now I know things about the deck that maybe Ferdinand and Isabella did not know. And that's a problem. That's a problem from my point of view, because I no longer have the choice of which way to play. Right? With Twilight Struggle, I need to know what those victory point location cards are. Otherwise, I don't have the knowledge that the actual players of the actual countries had in their foreign policy decisions, what they weighted and what they considered valuable. I don't know that. There are events in EU that if you don't know what they are ahead of time, you certainly can't play effectively. But also, just like with Paths of Glory, you're probably not going to be able to react to them properly. Like, you're not going to be able to do them historically unless... You're not going to be able to make the historical choices unless you're given some forewarning. Very few. Generally what it has to do with is there's things you can do that are stupid. Like diplomatic choices that you can make with minors that can fuck you over. And it feels very frustrating. Your choices of victory points are going to be ill-informed, and you won't understand whether you should be going after them directly or whether you should be holding off until you get some specific event. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on there, and I don't like that about it. I feel like there's sort of a middle ground there. And again, I think there's a way of fixing the victory point choice. The problem, of course, with EU is victory points are meaningless. The game's victory points are just so unbalanced and horrible. Maybe they work in some of the periods, but they obviously do not work in others. early, when Russia first comes in the game, they're just going to lose points. And what's worse is if you're playing the Grand Campaign, they're not only not going to be able to recover their points, but their nation is fucked by the events of that. They're just, the historicity of the events is the problem, to tell you the truth. They're just they do too much damage to the Russians for them to recover from it. But that's that game having flaws of a different nature and that need to be fixed. And they could be fixed. From what I can tell, though, I did play with the Risto events last time, and I don't feel like they helped enough with any event. So yeah, I mean, overall, there's a real difference between what a CDG and what other events can provide you with in terms of gameplay. And it's my view, at least, that that events that are placed on cards can become very, very problematic more easily than the ones that are put into books. Now, the CDG style of play is really intriguing and pleasing and everything for me at a certain level of play. That level of play kind of means the events aren't going to be too hefty, so that they fit on a card for the most part, which allows you to assess them more easily. Most of the cards aren't going to be things that you have to keep reading and looking at to make your choices. I hated this in Clash of Sovereigns. Every card seemed like it had a complex event, and, then you have to balance that against the point. Do you want this complex event? And, then other considerations like when you want to play it and everything. And I fear this is going to be more along those lines than otherwise, and more along the lines of Virgin Queen, where there's just points for all kind of things. I'm not positive of that. I'm not absolutely positive of that. I know that I hate the chart for getting victory points in Virgin Queen, sort of the huge manifold of things you can do to get victory points. I'm not convinced that that's going to be as big a deal. Compare that then, okay? So the decisions I'm making in Here I Stand, in Virgin Queen, is all based on getting my points in a point salad, or getting the automatic victory, right? I got both of those. But getting my points in the point salad is the thing that I'm likely going to be trying to aim for, even though I may use the threat of an automatic victory. And it might work. In EU, first of all, the victory points don't matter, in a way. Like, hey, it's cool to calculate them out and everything, but I know it's not a competitive game. I know that the victory points are so fucked up that it just doesn't work. So I kind of put them to the side. They become much, much less important. But the idea of improving your nation and trying to make it stronger and more capable of operating, that's what's beautiful about that game. Now, Turkey can't do that. Spain can't do that. Like, they can for a while, but then they take big jumps and get ahead for a while, and then they almost invariably become too weak at the end of the game, just because it's trying to tie you to the history. EU Pop, I didn't really feel. I feel like it was sort of a compromise between the two, right? Obviously, yes, I'm interested in victory points and all that. And there are little bonus things I can get that are victory points, but they're kind of like the victory point goals that you pick in the original EU. You're kind of like looking at cards and saying, yeah, I can make this one. And you just don't go for the ones you don't get. And I think you actually get penalized for not making them, if you're holding these cards. But you, or for trade, and also for trading them in or something like that. But, you get points for the ones you can make. And sometimes you're just screwed out of it all. But at the same time, you're building a little engine for yourself. Your country is becoming more powerful and stronger. And it's beautiful in that because what you're looking at is the rise of the nation states. So it works perfectly well. The nation state itself is moving from a medieval era, or the nation itself is moving from a medieval era of feudal lords who are loosely tied to the king and to actual nations that can, deliver all their power. So it's almost a perfect situation for that snowballing engine building type of mechanism in play that is very appealing in a lot of games, but isn't historically accurate in a lot of them. Whereas these CDGs don't have that appeal, right? You're not really improving your situation. I think Time of Wars had something like that. At least for some of the countries, you got more cards by building something up, but and you had things like the Polish economy to run and stuff like that. But it was all like, it all felt Euro-ish, like you're moving things on a track to indicate how well you do, as opposed to like, yep, my colony produces this much money, this happens, this happens. And yeah, I would much prefer, now, EU Pop didn't have as much of that feeling. There it felt like a lot of it had to do with how good your ruler is. How good your ruler is. If you had a good ruler, you got lots of cubes. There were things you could do and build up to get you more, but for the most part, it didn't have the same kind of snowballing engine feeling that the original EU has. And that the computer game itself has. I feel like in a lot of ways, EU Pop not only didn't match the original board game, but it also didn't really do what the computer game does. It tried to make it into a super heavy Euro that like, I don't know. Anyway, and maybe there are engines in there that I'm not thinking of, whatever. I mean, there certainly are some, but they just don't feel like the same kind of thing as building up this huge economy in the original Europa Universalis.